The less you eat, drink, buy books, go to the theater, to the ball, to the tavern, think, love, theorize, paint, fence, the more you save, the greater your treasure becomes, which neither moth nor robbery can devour, your capital. The less you are, the less you manifest your life. The more you have, the greater your alienated life becomes. The more you accumulate of your estranged being. With these words, Marx launches a critique of the capitalist system, which, as it's well known, is founded on the concept of capital. The central point of his criticism is clear. The more money we accumulate, the more we save to enrich ourselves, and the more we lose control, ultimately sacrificing the only thing that truly matters, our life. This critique recalls a famous novel by the Italian author Giovanni Verga, Mastro Don Gesualdo. The story emblemizes the prototype of the bourgeois. The protagonist is miserly and spends his entire life accumulating wealth and property, until he has no other goal beyond endless accumulation. In the end, he dies completely alone, powerless as his relatives strip him of everything he had amassed throughout his whole life. In this video, we will explore Marx's critique of the capitalist system, particularly focusing on his deep economic analysis, and at the end, we will reveal his prediction regarding the fate of capitalism. By the way, next week we are organizing a conference about Karl Marx. It is a completely free event, thought for those who are passionate about philosophy but are not academic experts. During the conference, we will first introduce Marx and some problems related to his philosophy. And then we will open a discussion where everyone has the chance to participate actively with some questions. If you have any questions or if you would like to participate, feel free to contact me through the links in the description. In a previous video, I explained the true meaning of communism for Marx and concluded that history is a process directed toward the realization of communism. What are the characteristics of his historical movement? Marx and Engels adopt an important idea from the historians such as Ferguson, Smith and Miller. The foundation of civil society in all stages of history is the way in which humans secure their subsistence, making it essentially economic. The satisfaction of basic needs and the increase in population generate new needs, which require a more complex division of labor to be met. The level of development of productive forces is therefore indicated by the degree of development of the division of labor. Historically, this has taken various forms, leading particularly to the separation between countryside and city, that is, between agriculture on one side and commerce and industry on the other, and later even between the industry and commerce. The mode of production does not encompass society in its entirety, it is merely its foundation. In fact, civil society consists of the entire network of material relationships between individuals, within a specific degree of development of productive forces. Different levels of division of labor correspond to different productive forces and different forms of property. Marx and Engels distinguish four types of property. First, tribal property, in which hunting, fishing and pastoralism predominate, and later agriculture also emerges. In this stage, the division of labor is still minimal. 2. Ancient communal property, where the state has been established and where the main productive forces used by property owners consist largely of slaves. This form already includes the division of labor between city and countryside, and thus between agriculture, industry and commerce. 3. Feudal property, where agriculture predominates. Society is hierarchically organized into orders and guilds, and the first forms of capital begin to emerge. 4. Capitalist property, where industry dominates. Only by starting from the different modes of production, along with the associated forms of property, is it possible to understand history in its entirety. In our period of history, we no longer live under capitalism, and the type of property is quite different. If you're curious to know what the current dominant economic system is, you can watch the video where I present this new perspective and explain how capitalism died. We are gonna mention now something that by Marx is usually misunderstood, This is the fundamental division between the so-called structure and, on the other hand, the superstructure of the world. Human history is the development of the forms of production, of the material life and their corresponding social organization. This doesn't mean that it's possible to do this totally of social forms and relationships from the mode of production, but rather that it is a necessary condition to explain the nature of social and political institutions and their mutual influences. Ideas and cultural productions, religion and even philosophy, as well as politics and law, are not generated independently, but are also products of specific types of economic and social organization. This means that to understand the historical process, one must start from the ways in which humans produce their material life, rather than from what they say or think about themselves. The materialist conception of history proposed by Marx and Engels differs significantly from other socialist perspectives, because it is built on scientific basis, namely an analysis of the historical process and the real conditions that will lead to the transition to the socialism. In contrast, other perspectives, such as that of Proudhon, described in Marx the poverty of philosophy, are merely imaginary and utopian constructions. Proudhon accepted Ricardo's economic theory of society based on harmony, but extended it as valid for every historical era, relying on eternal laws and ideas as the driving forces of history. By explaining economic phenomena in the moral and philosophical terms, he mystified the real economic and historical basis of capitalist society, ultimately advocating not for its abolition, but for an abstract ideal of justice oriented toward a better distribution of wealth and policy of classes collaboration. Proudhon's mistake was the attempt of explaining economic phenomena in a moral and philosophical terms. He mystified the real economic and historical basis of capitalist society, ultimately advocating not for its abolition, but for an abstract ideal of justice oriented toward a better distribution of wealth and a policy of class collaboration. In their most important text, the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels strongly opposed to this perspective, instead presenting class struggle as the driving force of history. They write, "The history of humanity has been nothing but the history of class struggle. Free men and slaves, patricians and plebeians, barons and serfs, oppressors and oppressed, in a constant opposition, waged a war, sometimes open, sometimes concealed. A war that always ended either in a revolutionary transformation of the entire society or in the destruction of the both contending classes. The position and historical mission of the classes are determined by their placement within specific modes of production. The division of labor from which private property derives generates social inequality and therefore conflicts between particular interest and the collective interest, between individual activity and the power of those who control this activity. From this emerges the class struggle. When a given stage of the division of labor no longer corresponds to the appropriate social relations, the relationship between productive forces and forms of social cooperation enters into contradiction, generating a crisis and a revolutionary transition to a different mode of production and dominance of the new class. This is exactly what happened with the bourgeois against the previous feudal world. They write, "The bourgeois has played an essentially revolutionary role in the history. Wherever it has gained power, it has trampled on a feudal and patriarchal relations. It has mercilessly crushed all the colorful bonds that once united the feudal man to his natural superiors, leaving no other ties between man and man than cold self-interest, than callous cash payment. The rise of the bourgeois coincides with the development of capitalism. Only with the modern form of property and the rise of industry does a mode of production extend on a global scale. But with it, a massive force of production, the industrial proletariat, is generated, destined to overthrow the bourgeois rules and lead to the elimination of classes and the division of labor. In the revolution, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." The capitalist system is based on a massive production and accumulation of commodities. To understand capital, therefore, one must start with the analysis of commodities. A commodity is something that satisfies human needs, whether material or intellectual, serving for survival, pleasure, or production of other goods. This is its use value, which is realized only when this commodity is consumed. Beyond use value, there is exchange value, which indicates the quantity in which one commodity can be exchanged for another. For example, a certain amount of grain for a certain amount of silk or gold. Every commodity has a different exchange values, depending on the commodities with which it is traded. For exchange to occur, these values must be equivalent, meaning they must have something in common. But these common characteristics cannot depend on use value, since each commodity has a different utility. So what does all commodities have in common? Abstract human labor. This means that, despite the difference between various types of labor, they can all be reduced to the same fundamental basis, the expenditure of human labor. Consequently, a commodity has value only because human labor has been incorporated into it. This value is measured by the amount of labor required to produce it, calculated in terms of time. To determine this measure, one must disregard the time required by an individual worker. Clearly, if a worker is unskilled or lazy, they will take longer to produce an object, and paradoxically, their product would be more expensive than of that skilled and diligent worker. Instead, it is the socially necessary labor time, the average labor time required under specific historical conditions of production, that determines the value of the produced object. When commodities are exchanged without recognizing the human labor behind them, a particular phenomenon occurs. They appear to have an intrinsic value, independent of their producers. This is similar to what happens in religion, where a man-made object, the fetish, becomes an autonomous deity. This phenomenon, which Marx calls the fetishism of commodities, is characteristic of capitalism, in which the product dominates man, and social relationships appear as mere relationships between things, independent of those who produce them. Money is the general equivalent of all commodities and allows their price to be determined on the market based on the relationship between supply and demand. The price represents the exchange value of commodities in a quantitative terms. However, in the capitalist system, buying and selling goods is not just about obtaining consumers' goods, but primarily about increasing money, therefore the profit. In a traditional commerce system, money is used to purchase goods that are then resold to obtain more money following the formula CMC, commodity, money, commodity. In the capitalism process, however, the logic changes. The formula becomes MCM, where the second M is greater than the first one, meaning that the money obtained at the end of the process is higher than the initial investment in purchasing the commodity. But how is this profit generated? It cannot simply come from selling goods at a higher price than their exchange value. According to Marx, the key lies in production, not in the circulation of commodities. Profit arises from the exploitation of a special commodity, namely labor power, the human energy used to produce goods. This commodity exists in the market because there are legally free individuals who own their labor power but are forced to sell it to survive. This situation is not eternal but characterizes the modern era, and it is necessary for the development of the capitalist production. In this system, labor itself becomes a commodity in the form of labor power. Another fundamental condition is the existence of individuals who own the means of production, the capitalists. They invest part of their capital in wages, purchasing labor power with the goal of making a profit, which Marx calls the surplus value. But how can purchasing labor power generate surplus value? According to Marx, the key lies in surplus labor. Like any commodity, labor power has an exchange value, determined by the average amount of labor time necessary to produce it. This value is not based on the worker's performance, but on the cost of ensuring their survival, reproduction, and acquisition of necessary skills. Surplus value arises if the wages paid by the capitalist covers only part of the worker's labor time, specifically the time necessary for their subsistence. If, for example, this part corresponds to 6 hours, then all work performed beyond this threshold in the workday constitutes surplus labor, which, being unpaid, generates surplus value. The rate of surplus value is calculated by comparing surplus labor time to the time required for the worker's subsistence. The surplus value is the central goal of the capitalist production, and it is generated in the production phase. In Capital, Marx analyzes the different historical stages of labor organization, seen as various methods of extracting surplus values. In capitalist production, there are various ways to organize labor, but all have the same goal: maximizing surplus value. The foundation of this method is cooperation, meaning the work of many people in the same place and at the same time, following a common plan. This characteristic distinguishes manufacturing and factory work from the craftsmanship, where labor can be performed individually without direct coordination. In the capitalist economy, cooperation increases productivity, but deprives workers of control over their labor, unlike artisans who retain autonomy. When surplus value is entirely consumed as income, it is called simple reproduction. If, instead, part of it is reinvested to increase productivity, it results in expanded reproduction, which leads to capital growth. This phase develops in industrial capitalism, where part of the capital is used to purchase machinery, constant capital, while workers' wages constitute variable capital. Machines play a crucial role in increasing productivity because they enable a more detailed division of labor. While an artisan performs various operations using different tools, in the factory, every task is divided into specific operations assigned to different workers. This system enhances efficiency but makes labor repetitive and fragmented. The more specialization increases, the more the workers become dependent on capital, not only because they do not own the means of production, but also because they lose the ability to perform a complete trade. All the phases necessary for producing a good are now carried out by an integrated system of workers and machines. The peak of this transformation is reached with the division of labor between different machines and the introduction of the assembly line. In this system, workers must adapt to the rhythm of the machine, becoming easily replaceable and losing all their autonomy. This reintroduces a new form, the issue of alienation, which Marx has already addressed in his early writings. Workers no longer have control over their task or the use of machines. They are completely subordinated to the decisions of others. This leads to an extreme separation between manual and intellectual labor, reserved for managers, and intensifies the conflict between the productive forces. To avoid being overtaken by competitors, the capitalists must constantly reinvest surplus value into machinery, namely constant capital, while trying to keep wages low, namely the variable capital, to maintain high profits. However, Marx believed in a fundamental law leading to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which results in a progressive concentration of capital in fewer hands. At the same time, the poverty of workers increases. Machines can replace many jobs, leading to higher unemployment, a greater supply of labor power, and lower wages. In this context, a contradiction emerges between the private ownership of the means of production and the social nature of production, namely between the development of the production forces, the proletariat, and the small number of capitalists. Marx argued that capitalist production, by its very nature, inevitably leads to its own negation. For Marx, the emancipation of the working class could not happen solely on a political level. In his text, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, he stated that the society does not cease to exist until it has exhausted all the productive forces it can sustain. Consequently, humanity only faces problems it is capable of solving once the material conditions are ready. The fact that productive forces continue to grow but fail to reduce workers' misery, combined with the increasing class consciousness, led Marx to predict the overthrow of capitalism and the rise of a new society. Marx envisioned an initial phase, the dictatorship of a proletariat and temporary stage of leading to the abolition of classes. The so-called reign of necessity under capitalism would be followed by the so-called reign of freedom, where the human capabilities could be fully developed, enabled by the use of machines to reduce the toil, shorten the workday, and increase productivity. In his text, Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx described this future society, in which the state would no longer be necessary, as a place where the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. The first stage, guided by the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his work, would eventually lead to the full communism, where the guiding principle would be from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan and this is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.